לפני שיגש לעניינים העיקריים, להגיד לכם כמה דברים לגבי נושא של שיתוף הפעולה, עליו שם דגש נשיא האוניברסיטת בר אילן. אז כבר עמוס הודע וציין את השותפים שלנו שעומדים איתנו בעבודה, אבל צריכים לזכור בסופו של דבר מדובר גם על אנשים. אז קודם כל אני רוצה להגיד תודה מיוחדת לשתי נשים נהדרות שעבדו ללא לאות באמת להכנת הכנס הזה מבחינת כל הבחינות האפשריות, גם התוכניות וגם הארגוניות, לדוקטור עינת לוי גיגי מאוניברסיטת בר אילן, ולגברת כרמית פדן. בכנס הבא אני כבר נקרא לה דוקטור כרמית פדן, על העזרה הנהדרת שהיא עובדת איתי במכון כאן, על העזרה הנהדרת שלה גם. אז אחרי שאמרתי את הדבר הכי חשוב הזה, אני רוצה להוסיף כאן שאנחנו גם כן פרסנו כנפיים, אנחנו מאמינים גדולים בשיתוף פעולה ובעבודה משותפת עם בינלאומית, גם ישראלית וגם בינלאומית, ולכן הכנס שלנו עשיר, בעיקר עשיר איכותית בכמה אורחים באמת מיוחדים במיוחד. האחד מהם, אני רק אזכר את שמותיהם, האחד הוא פרופסור מיגל סנטנו. איפה אתה? Where are you, מיגל? מיגל? אוקיי. הוא מצטנע שם מאחור, מאוניברסיטת פרינסטון. תודה לך על כך שבאת אלינו. השני הוא פרופסור ג'ורג בוננו, מאוניברסיטת קולומביה. תודה שבאת אלינו. השלישי הוא פרופסור סלובץ' קירי, מהונגריה, תודה לך שהגעת. והרביעי הוא סגן אלוף טימותי מטקלף, שהוא הנציג של ה-National Guard, המשמר הלאומי האמריקאי בישראל, ותודה רבה לך גם על זה. יש לנו עוד תוספת אחת שאני רוצה להצביע עליה, וזה האומן צביקה לחמן. צביקה, איפה אתה? הנה צביקה, שאת העבודות המדהימות שלו, אחר כך תוכלי לראות פעם נוספת, אחרי שהוא ירצה לנו על עבודתו, כאן בלובי שלנו, הרעיון להכניס גם מימד נוסף, רוחני, אומנותי לשיח הזה, הוא רעיון של עינת, ותודה רבה לך על כך. אני חושב שזה מאוד חשוב ומאוד מעניין לשמוע ולחוות איך אומן מתייחס לכל הסוגיות האלה שאנחנו נדבר עליהן היום, שבדרך כלל אנחנו עוסקים בהם בממד הלאומי, האסטרטגי, הביטחוני, וכאן יש לנו זווית רעננה, אז תודה רבה לך על כך. אז זה, את התוכנית אתם מכירים, ותודה שבאתם. אני רוצה לבקש מעמיתתי עינת להגיד כמה מילים מצידה, ואז נוכל לגשת לעניינים. תודה לכם.
בוקר טוב. רבי נחמן מברסלב אמר כי כל העולם כולו גשר צר מאוד. ניתן לטעון שהגשר הצר... למיקרופונים באמצע. ניתן לטעון כי הגשר הצר מייצג סכנה גדולה. פחד, חרדה, בדידות, תחושה שאין מנוס ואין מוצא. חשיפה מתמשכת לאירועים טראומטיים כמוהו כאותו גשר צר. אזרחים באזורי קונפליקט, כמו גם אנשי כוחות הביטחון וההצלה, מרגישים לא פעם כי הם צועדים על קרקע רעועה וסכנת הנפילה מרחפת מעל כל צעד. בביקור שערכנו כחלק מכנס זה בתחילת השבוע בסדרות, אמר לנו תושב העיר כי עבורם אין פוסט טראומה, רק טראומה. ארוכה, מתמשכת, ללא התחלה וללא סוף. המציאות הקשה אותה הוא מתאר היא חלק בלתי נפרד מהחיים במדינת ישראל. אני רוצה להציע שאותו גשר, צר ככל שיהיה, הוא גם אפשרות והזדמנות ליצור חיבור וקשר. מטרה זו עמדה לנגד עינינו כשתכננו את הכנס הנוכחי. ניסינו לגשר בין ממצאים במחקר המדעי לבין התחושות ודרכי ההתמודדות בשטח. בין ההסתכלות המערכתית אסטרטגית לבין חוויותיו של האדם הפרטי. בין ניסיון טבעי, אך עם זאת מפתיע בנדירותו, להבין ולהגדיר את הפגיעות שיוצרת הטראומה, לבין ההכרה בכוחות ובחוסן של האדם והחברה. לבסוף נעשה ניסיון ייחודי לחבר בין טראומה וחוסן חברתי לבין אומנות, תוך הסתכלות על השבר וייצוגו באומנות הפלסטית לאורך ההיסטוריה ועד ימינו. אני מקווה שתצאו מהיום הזה כשאתם מודעים לקושי הקיים, אך גם מכירים בכוחות שיש לנו, כיחידים וכחברה, ללא פחד. כי הפחד, כפי שהבין רבי נחמן מברסלב, יכול להוות מכשול מרכזי שעשוי למנוע מאיתנו להישיר מבט ולהשמיע קול. אני מאחלת לכולנו כנס מעשיר ומוצלח. תודה. אני שמחה להזמין את פרופסור ג'ורג בוננו. ג'ורג בוננו הוא פרופסור לפסיכולוגיה קלינית מאוניברסיטת קולומביה. הוא חוקר מוביל בעולם בתחום החוסן. בנוסף, בזמנו החופשי הוא גם עוסק באומנות, הוא ביקש ממני להזכיר את זה. אנחנו באמת, זו זכות גדולה עבורנו שהוא הגיע לכאן, והוא יבוא ויספר לנו עכשיו על המחקר שלו. ג'ורג בוננו.
Good morning. I'm always delighted to come to Israel. It's beautiful, it's interesting, and I'm very happy to be at this meeting. I'm an academic researcher. I'm going to tell you about my research. I've been doing this for about 25 years, trying to understand resilience. I'm going to tell you about that research in all its unadulterated form, and I hope that it's useful, and I hope that this can set the stage for some of the broader things you'll hear today. So I want to begin with this question, a question I think about all the time. What is resilience? So here are some of the things you may have seen, the definitions you may have heard of. It's a development and maintenance of healthy adaptation. You can hear me okay? The translator's coming through. A trait, it's a kind of a type. It's a cluster of capacities, a multidimensional process, a positive outcome. The question we have to ask is which of these is the correct definition? If we want to understand resilience conceptually, practically, clinically, from research world, we can't have multiple definitions of the same phenomenon, otherwise we're talking about different things. So which definition is correct? The answer, ironically, is they all are, but not, this is very important, not because they're equally viable, not because any definition will matter. It's because each of these speaks to a piece of a larger whole. I think of resilience as an umbrella term, a term that captures a range of elements unfolding over time. That's what I want to tell you about today. In a recent paper, we were invited, there's a journal called Psychological Inquiry that invites a paper and then has people comment on it. For this paper, we call this the temporal elements of psychological resilience, and we tried to use this framework to integrate the research on individuals, families, and ideas, individuals, families, and communities. We argued that to be a useful framework, the study of resilience must explicitly reference 4 elements. And I want to show you what those are. This is the graph of these elements. So this is much simpler than it looks. I'm going to walk you through it. First, we need time. We can only really think about resilience over time. We often think of it in a stagnant way, but we really must think of it over time. Then we have to ask ourselves the obvious question, very simple question, resilience to what? So we think of some aversive circumstances. Here are just the 2 broadest brushstrokes we can make. An acute event, an impactful event, a bomb, and a chronic stressor. Einat mentioned sterot, chronic repeated exposure. So these are the 2 broadest brushstrokes. Then we say, well, what is the outcome? So we need some measure of resilient outcomes. So we need some way to define health and dysfunction. When you say Israelis are resilient, they're resilient and distraught, in what way? And that's a question we have to ask ourselves. If we have only this information, we already have at least 2 kinds of resilience. Now I don't sit still. I'm Italian and I move and I use my hands. So I want to walk over there, but I'm just going to point with my hands. So most of what I will tell you about will be about resilience. Most of what I'll talk about will be in relation to acute events, so single incidents. And when we have that experience, we have resilience looks like that line I've drawn, minimal impact resilience, a quick return to normal functioning. Are you all okay with this things moving around? Okay.
Just a minute. Resilient.
You are. Okay.
Slow moving, maybe this is good.
Yeah, I should just why don't you all just move around? When we have chronic events, when we have chronicity, we don't see this kind of pattern because there's disruption. There's disruption and there are things we call symptoms. So you see more of this is in the top line, but then when that stressor ends, people move into the normal range, and we call that emergent resilience. I won't have time to get into both of those, but those are at least 2 that we've been able to identify. Then we can talk about what people were like before the thing happened, the adjustment beforehand. Anytime we talk about resilience, we're making an implicit assumption that there was some baseline level. So we need a measure of baseline adjustment, baseline functioning. Then we can talk about things that predict, things that make us resilient or less resilient. And again, we need to decide whether we're talking about things that people brought to the event, aspects of the event itself, or things that happened afterwards. Then we start seeing patterns. I've spent my career trying to identify different patterns. We can talk about people who are more resilient, less resilient, not resilient, and we have a mix of people. Israel is a resilient country without doubt, but there's a mix of people in this country and a mix of reactions. So if we have just these data, we can begin to even see different patterns that people might follow, and when we follow people over time, we get quite a mess. I've spent my career trying to understand this mess, this set of patterns. In 2004, I published a paper that had some influence, arguing that there were 4 primary patterns, prototypical patterns that people tend to follow after a traumatic event. And these are those patterns. Since then, we've collected a lot of data. We're researching constantly, and we have a better idea of what portion of the population will show those patterns. Some people will be harmed psychologically, undoubtedly. Some people will show problems over time. Some people will recover. And I've been particularly interested in this area. You can't see it. I'm going to yell. You can't see it, but down here, there's a question mark. And that question mark, when I first began my career, was how many people show complete health after a bombing attack or other kind of stressor. How many people are just plain resilient after something happens? And at the time, the answer was probably not very many people, because trauma is trauma is trauma. But it turns out, when we do measure these patterns, that most people in the general population across the world show that pattern, that pretty much stable health. This is the modal outcome, the most common outcome. And when we actually can do population studies, we find it's the majority of people across the world so far have shown that pattern. Now, we don't always have time to play with. We don't always have that kind of data. So this was a study we did after 9/11, the 9/11 attacks in New York, where we had data just at one time. And this was a fantastic study that was done with my colleague Sandro Galea, who's an epidemiologist. And they were able to, we published some papers together, they were able to collect, to get data on a representative sample of New Yorkers. Most of you have been to New York. I assume there's a big connection between Israel and New York. And you know that New York is one of the most diverse cities in the world. This from a diverse country. This study, they were able to capture a representative sample. They were able to get a group of people that represented the diversity of the city, and they looked at post-traumatic stress disorder. We looked at post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is how it varied across different kinds of experiences. So you can see already there's variability in PTSD across these different kinds of experiences. Then we looked at people who had some symptoms, but not PTSD. That's these purple lines. And then we looked at people who had 0 or 1 symptom only. And we said these people are resilient. And you can see that's the yellow bar. There's lots of resilience. There was lots of resilience in New York after 9/11. But 0 or 1 is a kind of an arbitrary line to put for resilience. It could have been 0 or 2. It could have been 0 or 3 symptoms. Many people have a symptom or 2 of PTSD. They're just problems. They're not mysterious things. So there's an arbitrariness that we have to get beyond. I want to take about 2 minutes of my time to tell you a little bit about how we do this statistically. Now, I know not everybody's interested in statistics, so you have 2 minutes to check your email right now if it's not your cup of tea.
There's no connection yet.
So we have symptoms of PTSD or any other thing we might measure, and we like normal distributions. You all know what a normal distribution is when you get your grades in school. They're using a normal distribution. So the assumption is that the data will be normal. This normal means show that pattern. And in fact, most of the statistical approaches we've used historically have required that the data be normally distributed. The problem is when we measure PTSD or anything else in response to an event, it's never normally distributed. It shows this pattern, what's called a positive skew. it tapers off. Now, if you're only interested in PTSD, that's not a problem because you're talking about that tail. But if you're interested in everybody else, and I have argued you can't understand PTSD or trauma or anything else if you don't understand how everybody reacts. You have to understand it in context. So we need to put resilience in here somewhere. But it's obvious there's no clear place to put that line. There's no obvious place to put it. So we need to know more about what's going on with these populations. Here are 6 distributions from 6 different events. A mass shooting. We have lots of mass shootings in the United States. Spousal loss, traumatic injury, spinal cord injury, and different kinds of symptoms, distress, PTSD, grief. And you can see they all show that pattern. Here is one of those studies. This is a study of PTSD symptoms 1 month after emergency surgery for a traumatic injury. So it was a scary event from an automobile accident or something. You can see that it doesn't fit that normal distribution. It does fit the positive skew that I mentioned. But you can also see something else. It's bumpy. And in the statistical terms, we'd say this is multinomial, but it looks like there's clusters of people there. We now have methods to identify these clusters of people. And this is really because, I like to say, it's because of these things. This is more powerful than the computer I had when I was in graduate school. This can do everything. And because of that, we can now crunch numbers in a remarkable way. And this procedure called latent growth mixture modeling identifies groups within this other kind of distribution. The word mixture means normal distributions that are embedded in a non-normal distribution. That's technically what it means, but it essentially means we can find groups of people that cluster together in there that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. And we can follow them over time. That's where the latent and growth part comes. So we're really talking about a group of people that we can identify that coherently move over time together, a trajectory of people that's different from another trajectory of people. So this is how we do it. This is what we do. That's, by the way, the 2 minutes is up, so that's the end of the statistical part. So this is called the German panel data set. Every country, most countries in the world collect these kinds of data. This is a group of volunteers. People volunteer for study, and they're followed for many years, and the data become publicly available. It's very expensive to collect this kind of data. So typically the government or whoever pays for it will say this has to be available to the public. So we've used this data in Germany because they do a very good job. So this is a nationally representative sample of Germans followed for 19 years. This is about 17,000 people. Some researchers published in an economic journal wanted to know how their satisfaction with life satisfaction, varied in the years before and after these events: unemployment, layoff, marriage, divorce, death of a spouse, and birth of a child. And these are their data, their findings. So here's one of them. This is widowhood. This looks about what you would expect. The year before the spouse dies, life satisfaction is already dropping. The year the spouse dies, life satisfaction reaches its lowest point, and then it goes back up. So we reanalyzed these data using this mixture modeling approach that I just mentioned, and we found that there were 4 groups. And basically the way this works is we can explain the data better mathematically when we have these 4 groups. They're hidden groups. 21% of the sample, about 1 in 5 people, showed that green pattern, which is kind of like the average, but they didn't go back to baseline. So they had lingering difficulties. Okay, so 1 in 5 people are already struggling here, but the majority of people we found showed high life satisfaction throughout the study. We could only really identify this by taking apart the data. And then there were other patterns. Now I'm interested in other kinds of events, traumatic events, typically in my lab, so this is a traumatic injury study. I won't tell you all the details, but these are people who were taken to a level 1 trauma center, which in the US means a hospital that has the equipment to treat any kind of trauma 24 hours a day. So it's a designated hospital for physical trauma. So these are people who are in a motor vehicle accident or a gunshot or something like that. We did the same kind of analysis when they're in the hospital and then forward. Again, we found a lot of people, a little bit more than 1 in 5, had chronically elevated post-traumatic stress symptoms. So this trajectory of people showing chronically elevated PTSD. Despite that, we still saw that the majority had very few PTSD symptoms. This is another, I'll show you one more of these. This is a spinal cord injury study. I got very interested in spinal cord injury because it's a very, very difficult thing to go through. It's 3 in 1. First, you have an injury serious enough to lesion or sever the spine. So there's a traumatic injury. Second, you have the realization you've lost bodily functioning forever. All the people in this study were paralyzed from the waist down or from somewhere in the upper body down. And then you have the realization that that's happened, and you have a long period of rehabilitation where the person has to learn to use that body again without the functioning they had before. So this is very difficult, and it's very depressing. So we looked at depression and other symptoms in the spinal cord sample in the hospital and then forward. And you can see there's lots of depression, but again we found the majority showed no depression. And this dashed line right here that's the population average. So that's the average person on the street, and they're right on that line. So they're no different than the average person on the street in the hospital with a spinal cord injury. So again, this is human resilience, but there are also people who are not resilient and struggling, and we have to try to understand those differences. This slide just summarizes, this is a 5-year period, and these are studies during only a 5-year period, and you can see all kinds of events, a mass shooting, first responders, a hurricane, cancer, bereavement, combat deployment. You can see across all these studies, the majority showed a resilient pattern. I'm going to skip this, I think, but I wanted to tell you here. I'm just going to tell you about this, and I'll skip these slides because I want to talk to you a little bit. It's very important, if we can, to identify people before the event happens, to follow them over time. This is really a research question, but we find very important things. And I'm going to skip all. This is slides we had from the military, lots of resilience in the military. I'm going to skip this too, but one of the things that we've been able to do is to identify or to study mortality. So this is a study of people who've had a heart attack. And people get depressed when they have a heart attack. So we have data before and after the heart attack. But there was a finding among my colleagues in the medical school at Columbia that people who are depressed after a heart attack don't live as long as other people. So this is a very serious business. We want to know about this so we can help people. We don't want people dying after a heart attack. But what we didn't know is it people who became depressed, people who are already depressed, maybe both. So with this kind of approach, we can unpack this situation. And we looked at these different patterns, and we found it was this group, the group that became depressed. Those are the group that had a shorter mortality. The same thing we found for divorce. Now, I have no idea what the divorce rates are in Israel. I don't know if I even want to guess, but in the US, I know they're very high. We've done a couple studies on divorce, and we see these patterns. But again, there's findings that divorced people don't live as long as married people. Now, if you're divorced, that's a very serious finding. But again, the question is it all divorced people? Or is it some divorced people? And what we found again was this group. The group that became depressed. They had reduced mortality. So becoming depressed is not good for anybody. Again, this is another slide with the same thing. I'll just skip that. This is for chronic illnesses. I want to get to this question. If resilience is the norm, why isn't everybody resilient? There's a long, complicated answer to this question. How you make people resilient, but what we need to know first, why people aren't resilient. Why isn't everybody resilient? And there's a lot I can say about this. It has to do with the way our stress response system works. But the short answer is because, we can predict variability. There's lots of things that influence resilience. When we look at individuals, this is what we see. We see a whole range of predictors, variables that we can measure, and when we measure them all at the same time, we control for how they relate to each other. But we find many, many factors. No single factor explains much. Everything is a small effect, and they add up. So if you have a big pie chart, all the slices of pie are tiny here, little thin slices. So everything that we can measure explains only a little piece of it. There isn't a magic bullet. There isn't one or two factors that really tell us what's going on. So this is an important thing to know with individuals. Now, when we think about families and communities, what do we know? Unfortunately here, we don't know that much. And this has been something I've argued about a lot. And we made this point in the paper. There's a very rich literature on family resilience. Lots of things people have said about family resilience, but there isn't that much evidence. And we need the evidence to really understand what's going on. So most of the research on families is clinical research. It's about families that aren't doing well. There's very little research on healthy families. But the measurements are there. There's ways that people have measured and understood family dynamics that can tell us a great deal, but it hasn't been done yet. It's exactly the same thing with communities and you could say nations. There's been a lot of progress in identifying the possible predictors, things that will make for a resilient community. And this, of course, in Israel. What makes Israel resilient? It's undeniable that Israel is a resilient country. It's undeniable. But what makes Israel resilient? We can talk about it, but we need to really know what it is. We need to measure it. We need to test it. And that hasn't been done. The variables are there. So one of the things we did in a recent paper was we tried to look for the common factors that are likely to be the best bet. So when we look at individuals, there are three categories of predictors, three categories of things that make people resilient. One are the type of person we have. So a self-efficacy, a person who's confident and optimistic. Those people tend to be resilient. We also have identified something called flexibility. This is the capacity to modify in response to adversity, okay, to change, to figure out what's happening and change. And then the third, very important one we've seen is our social resources. Having supports, people to help with things. Okay, that's at the individual level. At the family level, though, we know these same factors exist and that we can measure them, we can see them. We know that there are families that people feel that this is an efficacious family, and observers can say that's an efficacious family. That's a family that gets things done. We know that there are families that are adaptable, more adaptable and less adaptable, and we know a lot about social relations among families. Some families have broad networks. This country, social relations in this country, forget about it. It's crazy in this country. At least that's my observation. And what about the community level? At the community level, we know there's been a whole research history of measuring effective communities, efficacious communities. Communities have opinions about how effective their community is, and researchers can see it. The same thing with adaptability and flexibility, and very much the same thing with social capital. The sense of community attachment, the sense of community connectedness. So all of these things can be measured at different levels. And all of these things, I think, are the key. These, I think, are the most promising avenues to explore, but it has not been done yet. These are the things that have to be measured in a longitudinal way, in the way I showed at the very beginning in that scheme, in order for us to really understand and make people, make communities, make families more resilient. And I think probably the good news is I have 5 minutes and I'm done, basically. But probably the good news is that the Israeli society is going to be very high in a lot of these factors. But I think it would be much better off, rather than me showing up in your country and saying, looks good, that's not very useful. Or even if you say, we're good here because we do these things, that's not going to get us anywhere. We actually have to know. So that's my plea, that we have to know, we have to measure it and test it and see, is this really what's driving the truck? Is this really what's pulling the horse? What's the phrase? Pulling the horse cart, something like that. And we need to know, and if not, then we need to fix it. But these are the questions we need to ask ourselves, and we need to actually be clear about it and methodical about it to see if that's really what's going on and how we can improve, or just so we know. That's really all I wanted to say. So I spoke fast. I'm from New York. As you know, we speak fast in New York. I want to thank the people that paid for this, including the Binational Science Foundation, the Israel-U.S. Binational Science Foundation, and the other funding sources. And thank you.